Wilber's integral theory is a version of perspectivism. There are two types of perspectivism: 1. Total relativism, symmetric relativism, all perspectives are equally valid, and 2. Partial relativism, asymmetric relativism, all perspectives have validity, but some are much better, more useful, more powerful than others, which implies some sort of higher truth, although absolute truth can never be reached because no perspective is absolute, and therefore all truth claims remain ambiguous, contested, and mired in relativism and subjectivism. Nietzsche was an advocate of the second kind of perspectivism. Wikipedia says, perspectivism rejects objective metaphysics, claiming that no evaluation of objectivity can transcend cultural formations or subjective designations. Therefore, there are no objective facts, nor any knowledge of a thing in itself. Truth is separated from any particular vantage point, and so there are no ethical or epistemological absolutes. Rules, i.e., those of philosophy, the scientific method, etc., are constantly reassessed according to the circumstances of individual perspectives. Truth is thus created by integrating different vantage points together. Truth is made by and for individuals and peoples. Clearly, Wilber is in this perspectivist game. Nietzsche wrote, "Insofar as the word knowledge has any meaning, the world is knowable, but it is interpretable otherwise, it has no meaning behind it, but countless meanings." Perspectivism. It is our needs that interpret the world, our drives and therefore and against. Every drive is a kind of lust to rule, each one has its perspective that it would like to compel all the other drives to accept as a norm. Wilber's integral theory is just his perspective, to satisfy his needs and drives. His trick is to pretend that he is somehow including all perspectives in some ingenious way that guarantees both that everyone is right, and also that an absolute truth, apex, absolute perspective, is attainable, this being non-dualism, according to Wilber. Wilber is basically claiming that he has successfully integrated all perspectives, which spiral up to an apex, absolute perspective, thus furnishing a theory of everything. In fact, all he has done is produce his own subjective perspective, and every one of his claims can be contested and refuted. Above all, it is impossible for Buddhist non-dualism to be the answer to existence. Only the PSR, enshrining Occam's razor, can be the answer to everything. This is the true Hegelian absolute idea, the basis of all reason and logic, and ontologically expressed through mathematics. Reality is totally based on rational, mathematical syntax. It is not an irrational, free-floating semantic system. Reality is form, the information carrier, and content, the information carried, syntax and semantics, signifier and signified, noumenon and phenomenon, map and territory. Regarding Nietzsche's perspectivism, Wikipedia says, Richard Schacht, in his interpretation of Nietzsche's thought, argues that this can be expanded into a revised form of objectivity in relation to subjectivity as an aggregate of singular viewpoints. These aggregated perspectives illuminate, for example, a particular idea in seemingly self-contradictory ways. Upon further consideration, they reveal a difference of contextuality and of rule by which such an idea, that is fundamentally perspectivile, can be validated. Therefore, it can be said each perspective is subsumed into and, taking account of its individuated context, adds to the overall objective measure of a proposition under examination. Wilber is in this game of trying to subsume perspectives in one system rather than saying, as philosophy, science and mathematics have traditionally done, that this perspective is right and that perspective is wrong. Wilber is determined at any cost, to the total cost of intellectual integrity, to insist that all perspectives are all least partially right. They're not. All human perspectives are false. The only correct perspective is reality's own perspective, and that is a strictly mathematical perspective. Mathematics is the language of reality and the means by which it understands itself. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, much of Nietzsche's reaction to the theoretical philosophy of his predecessors is mediated through his interest in the notion of perspective. He thought that past philosophers had largely ignored the influence of their own perspectives on their work, and had therefore failed to control those perspectival effects. He bluntly rejects the idea dominant in philosophy at least since Plato, that knowledge essentially involves a form of objectivity that penetrates behind all subjective appearances to reveal the way things really are, independently of any point of view whatsoever. Instead, the proposal is to approach objectivity, a revised conception, asymptotically, by exploiting the difference between one perspective and another, using each to overcome the limitations of others, without assuming that anything like a view from nowhere is so much as possible. The view from nowhere, from the singularity, exists and is exactly that of ontological mathematics. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, there is of course an implicit criticism of the traditional picture of a perspectival objectivity here, but there is equally a positive set of recommendations about how to pursue knowledge as a finite, limited cognitive agent. It's essential to abandon any perspective dependent on the human condition, i.e., on human feelings, perceptions, mystical intuitions, beliefs, opinions, and arrive at the a-perspectival objectivity of reality itself. It has its own perspective, not that of humanity, hence is a-perspectival in relation to the human condition. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, Nietzsche makes perspectivist claims not only concerning the side of the cognitive subject, but also about the side of the truth, or reality, we aim to know. His views on this topic have been highly controversial, with some scholars emphasizing Nietzsche's apparent denials of truth, either skeptical denials that any truth is ever knowable, or more radical claims that the very idea of truth is somehow incoherent, and others highlighting his own frequent and routine claims for the truth of his own views, as well as the valorization of truthfulness and honesty. A number of different strategies have been proposed for reconciling the tensions between these different strands of text, including the supposition that at least some of Nietzsche's own claims must fall outside the scope of his denials of truth, the idea that Nietzsche distinguished different senses of truth, and the developmental proposal that Nietzsche eventually gave up on his denials of truth late in his career. Nietzsche's position on truth was incoherent. He was excellent at highlighting the incoherence of the truth claims of many religions, sciences and philosophies, and he regarded math as pure abstraction, but his own truth claims, to the extent that he even supported the truth rather than the untruth, were mired in contradictions. Wilber falls into many of the same traps as Nietzsche, but for entirely different reasons and motivations. Moreover, Nietzsche was a genius. Wilber isn't. Nietzsche deployed perspectivism as a weapon against conventional thinking, whereas Wilber wants to include all conventional thinking as different perspectives, correct up to a point, in his overarching supposed theory of everything. Jennifer Hudgens wrote, "The major problem for perspectivism as an epistemology is that claims about perspectivism and its validity must also be limited by perspective, and thus perspectivism is internally unstable. Further, it apparently blocks its adherents from offering up the only kind of defense that its opponents would accept. The perspectivist cannot make claims about objective truth, where objective truth is defined as unique, bivalent." Wikipedia says, in logic, the semantic principle, or law, of bivalence states that every declarative sentence expressing a proposition, of a theory under inspection, has exactly one truth value, either true or false, independent of theory, and corresponding to the actual state of the world, because the perspectivist does not assume that we have access to the actual state of the world. Wilber is absolutely playing in this muddy, murky field, although he claims that through trans-rational meditation we can access Buddhist non-dualism, which is contended to be some sort of true actuality. The arguments against perspectivism are definitive. Any perspective advanced by a perspectivist is itself just another limited perspective. If you're in that game, how could anyone ever know what perspective is right, or better than any other perspective? What criteria would you choose with which to decide? But those criteria would themselves belong to a perspective. You could have chosen entirely different criteria, so there's no objective way forward, no possible route to the absolute truth. Jennifer Hudgens wrote, "Because of the lack of such an assumption, perspectives may be completely incompatible as well as incommensurable by any common standard. However, there is an internal logic within perspectivism akin to the coherence theory of truth that saves perspectivism from its realist opponents. In at least some cases, we find that there are values common to multiple perspectives. The coherence theory Anderson ascribes to Nietzsche is that the truth of beliefs increases according to the degree which those beliefs demand acceptance across a broader class of perspectives by satisfying shared epistemic standards. This kind of shared standard gives us the means by which to rank perspectives, as well as the means to argue against the thing in itself as an incoherent concept. Because our cognitive capacities are so limited by perspective, we cannot hope to acquire the knowledge which would justify claims of knowledge about the existence of the thing in itself. But values common to multiple perspectives is just another perspective, only as good as the opinions of those that subscribe to such a notion. There's still no escape from perspectivism. It's mired in relativism and subjectivism, exactly as Wilber's integral theory is. If no perspective is privileged above any other, perspectivism effectively reduces to relativism. The only perspective that can actually be privileged is the absolute eternal and necessary perspective of reality in itself, against all the relative temporal and contingent perspectives of humanity. Perspectivism usually tries to avoid degenerating into utter relativism by advocating a means for ranking the different perspectives. Wilber's spiral dynamic gradations are intended to rank the different perspectives and to privilege Buddhist non-dualism over all the others. But that's just his perspective. There is no breakout from relativism for perspectivism because there is no objective means to rank different perspectives. Once you've entered the labyrinth of perspectives, it's just one relative, subjective perspective after another. It's impossible to reach the absolute truth from perspectivism. Nietzsche, the God is dead man, did not believe in absolute truth. He believed in will to power, and he associated every perspective with its own will to power. Perspectives were justified, ranked, by how much power they wielded. Of course, as ever, this is just one more perspective. Will to power itself is an absolute truth claim, contrary to the claim that there is no such thing. Aperspectival. What does aperspectival mean? Ken Wilber wrote, beginning over 2 decades ago, with the book Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, I summarized this postmodern disaster with the term aperspectival madness, because the belief that there is no truth, that no perspective has universal validity, the aperspectival part, when pushed to extremes, as postmodernism was about to do, resulted in massive self-contradictions and ultimate incoherency, the madness part. And when aperspectival madness infects the leading edge of evolution, evolution's capacity for self-direction and self-organization collapses. Wilber's choice of the term aperspectival is simply bizarre. Postmodernism claims that no perspective can be privileged over any another. It certainly doesn't deny perspectivism or seek a viewpoint without a perspective, i.e. an aperspective. The claim that no one perspective can be singled out as absolutely true is an inevitable outcome of perspectivism, that's the entire point of it. Not some weird aberration. It's Wilber's own position that makes no sense. You can't defend perspectivism, i.e. say everyone is right, and then also claim that one perspective is absolutely right, which automatically means that all perspectives that disagree with that perspective are absolutely wrong. Wilber himself is someone who claims that every perspective is right, everyone has part of the puzzle, so he's hardly in any position to criticize postmodernism. He himself comes across as a postmodernist relativist and subjectivist, hence, by his own account, he suffers from what he illogically calls aperspectival madness. You can't say that everyone is right, that everyone's perspective is valid, and then claim that it's madness not to privilege one perspective over all the others. As soon as you do that, you have ceased to be a perspectivist and you are in fact claiming that all perspectives are wrong, bar the one that is right. Wilber certainly isn't a model of coherence. He's a perspectivist who claims that all perspectives are right and then immediately contradicts himself by saying that only one perspective is right, thus automatically denoting that all other perspectives are wrong. Wilber tries to, but totally fails, to have his cake and eat it, and ends up looking foolish and illogical. Aperspectival means not having a perspective, without a perspective. It certainly doesn't mean refusing to privilege one perspective over others. Why would you even be a perspectivist if you thought one perspective was absolutely right? In philosophy, perspectivism is the claim that knowledge of a subject is inevitably partial and limited by the individual perspective from which it is viewed, i.e., it's an attack on philosophical absolutism, the view that there is an absolute reality, a reality that exists independently of human knowledge, the existence of which is objective and not subject to the limits in space and time to which human knowledge is restricted. This viewpoint could certainly be referred to as aperspectival since it has nothing to do with any human perspective. In fact, any valid absolute truth claim can in no way be dependent on the human condition, given that the absolute truth existed before any human did. This means that Wilber cannot possibly believe in the existence of absolute truth, hence he is in exactly the same boat as the postmodernists, since his whole integral shtick revolves around the human condition and human meditation. Reality certainly doesn't meditate or engage in integral or Eastern mysticism or invoke Buddhist non-dualism to understand itself. Wilber is hoist with his own petard. In his own terms, he must suffer from aperspectival madness, no matter how wrongly the word aperspectival is being applied. What is a true aperspectival viewpoint? In the mid-19th century was born aperspectival objectivity, the attempt to eliminate individual idiosyncrasies from scientific work. Ronald L. Chrisley said, "One very compelling idea of objectivity is captured in the title of Thomas Nagel's book The View from Nowhere." According to this idea, since subjectivity is being bound to a single perspective, objectivity must be an escape from perspectives, a detached view, a view of a centerless world. The view from a centerless world, or in fact the unique view from the dead center of reality, the God view, so to speak. Wikipedia says, "The view from nowhere contrasts passive and active points of view in how humanity interacts with the world, relying either on a subjective perspective that reflects a point of view or an objective perspective that takes a more detached perspective." Nagel describes the objective perspective as the view from nowhere, one where the only valuable ideas are ones derived independently. The view from nowhere, from no human standpoint, is exactly that of God, of ontological mathematics, of the absolute idea, of the PSR, of Occam's razor, of eternity. It is the subspecie aetenitatis viewpoint, from the perspective of the eternal, under the aspect of eternity. It is the only objective viewpoint, the one freed from human perspectivism. It's the only viewpoint that can serve as an alternative to those limited, fallible, unreliable and delusional ones offered by the human condition. This viewpoint describes what is universally and eternally true, without any reference to, or dependence upon, the temporal, spatial and contingent order that dictates human perspectives. Ken Wilber's perspective is fully mired in the human condition, hence is false. Wilber goes nowhere near the eternal order of being. He has no clue what properties the absolute, objective truth must possess. They cannot rely in any way on human physicality, on human meditation. You cannot transcend the human condition by relying on the human condition. Only one viewpoint transcends all human viewpoints, that of the eternal and necessary order of the eternal truths of ontological mathematics, the absolute viewpoint, the God viewpoint, the viewpoint of perfect reason and logic. That certainly isn't a viewpoint that's of the remotest interest to Wilber, who would probably describe it in his peculiar way as another form of aperspectival madness, but in the opposite sense to which he previously deployed that phrase, in relation to postmodernism's failure to commit to an absolute truth. The only absolute truth Wilber is interested in is Buddhist non-dualism, which is in fact a wholly limited, human perspective, temporal and contingent, that gets nowhere near the eternal and necessary order of transcendence, the absolute singularity of being, equivalent to Aristotle's God, Plato's form of the good, Hegel's absolute idea, and the principle of sufficient reason, none of which has any conceivable connection to Buddhist non-dualism, a human, all too human conjecture, hence instantly dismissible. Ironically, given the nonsense Wilber talks in relation to the aperspectival, one way to reach the answer to existence is simply to identify the maximally aperspectival system. That system is ontological mathematics. The most aperspectival system is that produced by the PSR and Occam's razor, both completely untouched by the corruptions of the human condition.